Coming back to our essay, that's the fourth chapter, the core of the teaching. We had talked about the question of duties, and also before that a bit about the Yuga Dharma, the present practical, ethical, social, pragmatic, altruistic, humanitarian ideals that are really being seen as the new religion. And then Aurobindo brings out a point regarding the clash of duties, because duties do guide our life, saying that this is your duty as a teacher or a husband or a businessman. But then Aurobindo would tell us that nothing is as supreme as the call of God, which is imperative and cannot be weighed against any other considerations. Well, he gave us wonderful examples of Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna and the Buddha also, how they heard the inner call, the God's imperative call, and responded to that, leaving behind all norms of social duties. And then we argued that should Arjuna have fought, continued to fight, just because he is a Kshatriya and a warrior, because as a Kshatriya his duty is to fight, but somebody like Arjuna in whom the deeper sense, what we call the call of God, was awakened, should he have fought on, irrespective of what he feels within? And for a person like Arjuna, even to fight itself had become a sin. It was no more a question of running away, but he called it a sin. So here, in fact, I was just going through this latest Mother India issue of February 2007, and the first page I opened, 148 page number, adds a few things that we were talking about yesterday, and I thought I should read it out to you. February 2007, page 148. In fact, this is from the mother. In fact, the first human being that concerns you is yourself. You want to diminish suffering, but unless you can change the capacity of suffering into a certitude of being happy, the world will not change. It will always be the same. We turn in a circle. One civilization follows another, one catastrophe another. But the thing does not change, for there is something missing, something not there. That is the consciousness. That's all. At least that's my opinion. I'm giving it to you for what it is worth. If you want to build hospitals, schools, you may do so. If that makes you happy, so much the better for you. It has not much importance. When I saw the film Monsieur Vincent, I was very interested. He found out that when he fed 10 poor men, 1,000 came along. That was what Colbert told him. It seems you create them, your poor ones, by feeding them. You remember, this is what we were talking about yesterday, that have we lessened the number of the poor people or lessened the number of the sick people by constructing more of these hospitals and giving more of this food, etc. Mother says, And it is not altogether false. That means the more you feed the poor, the more poor people are being born, not born, are coming up, because there is this question of the charity. However, if it is your destiny to found schools and give instruction, to care for the sick, to open hospitals, it is good. Do it. But you must not take that very seriously. It is something grandiose you are doing for your own pleasure. Say, I am doing it because it gives me pleasure. But do not speak of yoga. It is not yoga you are doing. You believe you are doing something great, that's all. And it is for your personal satisfaction. There couldn't be anything clearer than that. So you can do what you want, but just don't say, I am doing yoga by constructing temples and by helping the poor and by doing this and that. It has nothing to do with yoga. That's because, as we explained later, earlier, that in yoga you are trying to diminish, erase, replace the ego with the divine. So the whole distinction between the common life and the life of yoga is between God and ego. In one, ego dominates and rules, and in the other, God rules. So here, in all these cases, she says, if you are happy, do it. We are not saying don't do any help to the humanity. But don't just confuse saying that I am doing yoga. This is there in the context, perhaps not direct context, but we have seen quite many letters in Aurobindo where people thought that they were doing yoga by all this. Then there also he makes it clear it has nothing to do with yoga. It is a human endeavor. It looks good. It may be helpful, no doubt about it. But because it increases your sattvic ego, it could be detrimental to yoga. That is the argument we had yesterday. So I just found one incident from the mother, and I thought I should read it out to you. And there is one more incident, not directly concerned, but when we are talking about the sin that Arjuna is speaking about, there is a relevant passage. Again in the same book, journal, the Mother India, and page 148. The title is Sinning Humanity. This reminds me of what happened in Paris when I was 17 or 18. There was a charity bazaar. This charity bazaar was a place where men from all over the world came to buy and sell all kinds of things, and the proceeds of the sale went to works of charity. All the elegance, all the refinement of high society was gathered there. Now, the bazaar was a very beautiful but not solidly built, because it was to last only for 3 or 4 days. The roof was of painted tarpaulin which had been suspended. Everything was lighted by electricity. The work was more or less decently done, but naturally with the idea that it was only for a few days. Well, I skip a few lines, and then what happens? There was a short circuit. Everything began to blaze up. The roof caught fire and suddenly collapsed upon the people. As I said, all the elite of society were there. For them, from the human point of view, it was a frightful catastrophe. There were people near the entrance who tried to escape. Others, all ablaze, also tried to reach the door and run away. It was a veritable scuffle. All the elegant, refined people who usually were so well-mannered began to fight like street rowdies. There was even a count of something or other, a very well-known man, a poet, a man of perfect elegance, who carried a silver-knobbed stick, and he was surprised in the act of hitting women on the head with his stick and trying to push forward. Indeed, it was a fine sight, something most elegant. Afterwards, lamentations in big society, big funerals and many stories. Now, a Dominican, a well-known orator, was asked to give a speech over the tombs of the unfortunate who had perished in the fire. He said something to this effect: "It serves you right. You did not live according to the law of God, and He has punished you by burning you." And every time there was a disaster, this story was repeated. Naturally, many people protested and said, "Here is a God whom we won't have." But these ideas are quite typical of ordinary humanity. Sinning humanity is altogether a Christian idea, which falsifies our idea of the divine. A divine who punishes poor people because it is their misfortune to be born sinners would not be very generous. Well, again, I brought out this again to tell ourselves about this idea why Christianity was losing its really grip. One of them is this question of the sinners being punished. The sinners being punished, and that God is a God who is there, keeping count of your good and bad and punishing you at all times. I think we in modern times, we have overgrown, come out of this concept of a punishing God. So modern mind can't accept this kind of a concept that we get punishment for our weaknesses. What was the problem with those people who got burned? It was not their sin. It just was an accident, but you cannot say God punished you. So this is one thing, again we see in the context of the Gita, that what type or what concept of God do we get here? These were two incidents that I thought I would read out from the mother. Next we have the question of altruism, which we had considered at a greater length in the previous thing. Here I would like to bring to you a couple of sentences only from Aurobindo's volume 3 and page 177, 78. Volume 3, Aurobindo's works. It's a beautiful note on the Mahabharata, while telling us the difference between the Deva and the Asura. In fact, sometime in our life divine classes, somebody had asked what the difference between the divine and the undivine. And we had defined there. But here, again, we have a beautiful explanation by Aurobindo. And of course, I won't go into that. That's not directly concerned with us right now. But here there's a sentence which caught my eye. The altruist is profoundly conscious of himself and is really ministering to himself even in his altruism. Hence, the hot and sickly odor of sentimentalism and the taint of the Pharisee which clings about European altruism. With the perfect Hindu, the feeling of self has been merged in the sense of the universe. He does his duty equally, whether it happens to promote the interest of others or his own. If his action seems oftener altruistic than egoistic, it is because our duty oftener coincides with the interests of others than with their own. Rama's duty as a son calls him to sacrifice himself, to leave the empire of the world and become a beggar and a hermit. He does it cheerfully and unflinchingly. But when Sita is taken from him, it is his duty as a husband to rescue her from her ravisher, and as a Kshatriya to put Ravana to death if he persists in his wrongdoing. This duty also he pursues with the same unflinching energy as the first. He does not shrink from the path of the right because it coincides with the path of self-interest. That is the central sentence, because right in the next paragraph, Aurobindo is going to talk about that. So this sentence, which is important, he does not shrink from the path of the right because it coincides with the path of self-interest. So we have to see what is this question of the path of the right. And the Pandavas also go without a word into exile and poverty because honor demands it of them. But their ordeal over they will not, though ready to drive compromise to its utmost verge, consent to succumb utterly to Duryodhana. For it is their duty as Kshatriyas to protect the world from the reign of injustice, even though it is at their own expense that injustice seeks to reign. So there are a few ideas now that are coming to the fore. This question of duty and dharma. You see, duty there's another passage, I think that makes it clearer. In fact, this is a letter actually. He would say, each one, we have a duty, as we have said, as a soldier, as a doctor, as a lawyer, and whatever. But Sri Aurobindo brings in a very fine, very subtle distinction here. He says, in the ordinary life, a personal, social, or traditional constructed rule, standard, or ideal is the guide. Now let us see, this is the concluding sentence, the difference between duty and dharma. In the ordinary life, a personal, social, or traditional constructed rule or standard. That means what we say, this is what our Shastra has said. This is what our, elders have said. This is what is our duty according to our own Indian culture. Whatever. It could be anything, constructed rule or a traditional or personal or social. That means that as long as we are in the common mental consciousness, if I can add that word, duty is a very good guide. That means this dharma or the duty that we are following as in our common life, they are a very good guide. Once the spiritual journey has begun, this must be replaced by an inner and outer rule or way of living necessary for our self-discipline, liberation, perfection. A way of living proper to the path we follow or enjoined by the spiritual guide and master, the Guru, or else dictated by a guide within us. But in the last state of the soul's infinity and freedom, all outward standards are replaced or laid aside, and there is left only a spontaneous and integral obedience to the divine with whom we are in union, and an action spontaneously fulfilling the integral spiritual truth of our being and nature. That is the concluding sentence that I wanted to give. So we have seen the question of altruism, the question of duty, the question of dharma. But as long as we are in our common mental consciousness, let us try to do the duty as best as we can. There are two or three, couple of things. Duty as best and as perfect as we can, number one. And give this work as an offering to the divine as many times as we can remember to do so. Because I'm recalling something from Sri Aurobindo, because somebody has written to him that we cannot come to settle down in Pondicherry or come to the ashram. You see, everybody cannot join the ashram. You have your own families and works and maintenance and all that. So that advice was this, that not exactly this, but somewhat, I should not misquote him, but somewhat in this line, that do the duty. You see, we are still using the word duty because commonly we are all on the mental level. But do the duty as well as we can. But second point that we need to add from the point of view of yoga is to offer to the divine. So this is the beginning of sadhana for those who are outside in a normal life pattern. Because we can't expect them to follow the ashram rhythm. So that's the first thing. Begin by offering, surrendering your work to the divine. The more we do that, we come closer to what the Gita is telling us, that not to have an attachment to the fruit of the work. Initially, nobody can disown or kind of give up the fruit of the work, because we are all expecting some result. But if it is done as an offering to the divine, gradually there comes a stage in your life wherein you realize, no, the fruit of the work is not mine, it is the divine's. So the whole attitude develops naturally. And of course, there's one thing that Sri Aurobindo adds, what in fact here directly we come to the Gita, the sense of equality and equanimity. So along with this duty, if we can add the sense of equanimity, then you can be on the path of yoga wherever you are in the world. You don't have to come to Pondicherry and to the ashram. That is one part. But then, as it says here, the moment you want to come and leap into a spiritual life, into the life of the sadhana, you have to listen to the higher call, exemplified by these three famous great souls, Sri Ramakrishna, Vivekananda and the Buddha. And of course, as I said, there are many young people in the world, there were people in the ashram who left behind even all those duties and came to the ashram. Well, again, let us not think that coming to the ashram is the ultimate. I would not like to give you this false idea. The whole thing is, wherever you are, in your stage of growth, if you hear this inner call very strongly, then sarva dharman parityajya. We can abandon all dharmas at that time. Not ritually saying, oh, now I'm 60, Shashti Purti is over and now I take a retirement and perforce I give it up. It's not the Shashti Purti that brings in. It is the development of a consciousness within, which you should have practiced for many years. This question of the surrendering, not to have attachment to the fruit of the work, etc. So if it comes to that, then Sri Aurobindo says, in the path of sadhana, there are no other dharmas that can bind you. Family dharma, social dharma, personal dharma, nothing is to bind you. What your guru has said, your master has advised, or your inner being has really called for, listen to that. That is why people take to sannyasahood, saying that it is the master who has told me, or my guru has told me, or there's a call. But also one has to be extremely, I would say, sincere and sensitive. Because to take a kind of a premature sannyasahood, this retirement, also harms. That is what our Indian system had said. You must have the brahmacharya, then you have the grihastha, then you go to sannyasahood through the vanaprastha path. So our Indian system had given a kind of a fulfillment of whole life. But there could be some persons in whom the call is sincere and deep. And it should not be a mental thinking, oh, I'll give up this life because I would like to be called or looked up as a sannyasa. Then you put on ochre clothes and you do this and that. There's nothing in the looks. All this external. You see in the ashram, many people who come from outside, they say, hey, where are the sadhaks here? Where are the great yogis? They go in the white shorts and white pants and our trustees or all our great people can be in shorts or in wonderful dhaka clothes. There's no external things to show that somebody is a great yogi here. In fact, People don't even know who is a yogi here unless Mother and Sri Aurobindo, they told that this person's soul is at this level. This is so common. I mean, one of the sanities of this ashram life or the integral yoga is to be as common as possible. I mean, in your habits, in your food, in your thinking, in your sports, in your games, you are a common human being. Don't try to really entrench yourself into this kind of activity, rejection of that activity, doing this, and then thinking that I'm trying to be a yogi. That's why the mother never allowed anybody in the ashram to quit the gymnastics or to stop coming to the physical education. You could go to the movies, we had a great yogi called Nalinikanth Gupta who till the end, as much as he could, he used to come every Saturday to the playground to see the movies. And as most of us know, the stature of that man spiritually, somebody who was living in the overmind on the borders of the supermind. But this was the integralism. He didn't say, oh no, I'm in the overmind, I should not see the Hindi movies or English movies. So you see, this was a wonderful example. We as kids who were there, we used to see Nalinida sitting beside us. I mean, you see, some of them have left indelible impressions on us. That's why even our great Arjuna would ask Sri Krishna, how do you judge a yogi? What does he eat? How does he walk? What does he wear? Same question. So a true yogi has nothing of this external paraphernalia to show that I am Nalinikanth Gupta, the great over-mental yogi. He used to come to the movies. He would come to the sports ground. And I must say, we had the privilege of playing football with him. I mean, he was in his 70s and we were in our young 20s, but I bet you that we couldn't kick as hard as he could the football ball. So that was the impression we had. Look, we have to live a common, normal life. The whole change is within. The outer is, nothing is visible. Nothing is visible. He would come to the dining room, he would go to the movies, he would watch a TV, he would do this. And when there were Olympics, he would be very excited to listen to the games. When there was India hockey match, he would listen to the commentaries. And yet we knew inwardly a man of that stature. So this is what we have to understand in this integral yoga, that there is no external show. There is no external rejection. The whole thing is the inner discipline, inner sannyasahood. Outwardly, Nalinida was as normal, as common as anyone in the ashram. He used to go and wash his clothes, he used to come to the bathroom, he would go to the TV. So then we understood, oh my God, this is what is an integral life. No show off from outer thing. So that is how we see this question of duty and then the call of the inner. And here was a man, suddenly the guru said, stop going to your wife. He used to go, every year once he goes to visit his wife in Calcutta. And one fine morning, mother or Sri Aurobindo, I don't remember, said, you are not going to Calcutta anymore to your family. Finish. One word from the master, he stopped all links with his family. He had children, he had a wife, he was not maintaining but looking after. So that's what we call, once you come to the spiritual path, then you have to be ready to give up at the command, at the drop of a hat, all other sarva dharma. Until then, follow the dharma you have as best as you can, surrendering it to the divine and with an equality. And what is that equality? Undoubtedly, the Gita does, like the Upanishads, teach the equality which rises above sin and virtue, beyond good and evil, but only as a part of the Brahmic consciousness, and for the man who is on the path and advanced enough to fulfill the supreme rule. It does not preach indifference to good and evil for the ordinary life of man, where such a doctrine would have the most pernicious consequences. On the contrary, it affirmed that the doers of evil shall not attain to God. Therefore, if Arjuna simply seeks to fulfill in the best way the ordinary law of man's life, disinterested performance of what he feels to be a sin, a thing of hell, will not help him, even though that sin be his duty as a soldier. He must refrain from what his conscience abhors, though 1,000 duties were shattered to pieces. This is where we were talking about the inner call. And with that inner call, if it becomes a sin, a kind of a suffering, so you cannot throw back Arjuna into the war field with the same consciousness. Yesterday I took off time to tell you what happened to Arjuna. That Arjuna who didn't want to fight is asked to go back to fight. But after a complete transformation of his inner being, the same Arjuna who hated to fight, he is not sent back. That Arjuna who thought that it is sin to fight, he is not gone back. But today, he is an Arjuna who has gone beyond good and evil, because he has been prepared by the Lord that how to get into that inner consciousness and act. So next paragraph, we must remember that duty is an idea which in practice rests upon social conceptions. We may extend the term beyond its proper connotation and talk of our duty to ourselves, or we may, if we like, say in a transcendent sense that it was Buddha's duty to abandon all, or even that it is the ascetic's duty to sit motionless in a cave. But this is obviously to play with words. Duty is a relative term and depends upon our relation to others. It's a father's duty as a father to nurture and educate his children. A lawyer's to do his best for his client, even if he knows him to be guilty and his defense to be a lie. A soldier's to fight and shoot to order, even if he kills his own kin and countrymen. A judge's to send the guilty to prison and hang the murderer. And so long as these positions are accepted, the duty remains clear, a practical matter of course, even when it is not a point of honor or affection, but overrides the absolute religious or moral law. You see, this pragmatic sense of duty overrides all other law morally or religiously. For example, as we said, the soldier kills. But morally, you are not supposed to kill another person. Religiously, killing other persons is wrong. But here the sense of the soldier says, look, I am given the order and I have to shoot. And sometimes you have to shoot your own kin and kith, your own countrymen. Like it happened during the British's time, that our own soldiers killed our own people. But he says, I am a soldier in the British army and I have my orders. So sometimes these duties go beyond the religious and the moral law. But what goes beyond the duty is your spiritual call. Because in the next paragraph he says, but what if the inner view is changed? If the lawyer is awakened to the absolute sinfulness of falsehood, the judge becomes convinced that capital punishment is a crime against humanity. The man called upon to the battlefield feels, like the conscientious objector of today, or as a Tolstoy would feel, that in no circumstances is it permissible to take human life any more than to eat human flesh. It is obvious that here the moral law, which is above all relative duties, must prevail. And that law depends on no social relation or conception of duty, but on the awakened inner perception of man, the moral being. So you see, that's what Aurobindo said in that letter, if you remember, or the mother in fact, that it is all a matter of our consciousness. On what level are we living? You see, today the lawyer defends a criminal because he says it's my duty, I'm taking fees, I'm taking heavy money from this criminal. And although he knows that this man has murdered, he says, I have to do my duty of trying to save my client. But then, the same lawyer, if there is a switch over into a new consciousness? And what if the inner view is changed? The lawyer is awakened to the absolute sinfulness of falsehood. You see, that is how the change of consciousness comes in. As long as you are on the mental level, these rules were there. But if this lawyer takes to a spiritual life and suddenly he feels from within, no, it is wrong to defend falsehood. That if I defend falsehood, then the falsehood will continue in this world. I am one lawyer defending one criminal. It's not one criminal name. It is the whole falsehood, the wrong, the perversion, the violence that I am supporting. So if this kind of a consciousness comes within him, he has to abandon. He can no more be a lawyer. Then he has to abandon his defense of the criminal, of the murderer. And then he says, I have to abandon this dharma of the lawyer. Why? Because in him is awakened a higher consciousness. So you see how everything is attached to the growth of your consciousness and not to the simple books where everybody has to follow the same thing. So this is how Aurobindo is telling us that Arjuna also was in a common consciousness, mental consciousness, overruled by those, the dharma of the age, influenced by asceticism. But what Sri Krishna does is uplift his consciousness. So Gita should uplift your consciousness and not become a kind of a book to quote. When people are on the deathbed, we go and quote a few verses. When people are in this yajna, it's not a scripture to quote. If it helps you to elevate your consciousness, and that is the perfect proof. You see, just think of Arjuna in the first chapter and in the last chapter. What has happened to Arjuna? A completely sea change in his consciousness. So that is the summum bonum of Gita. That we should read the Gita not as a scripture, but as a consciousness that can be connected with, and it helps us to elevate ourselves. So he says that is what has happened to Arjuna. And when that is taken up by Indians, by Westerners, because we have a lot of the Gita schools outside in the West also. I was there a couple of years back in Berlin, not in Berlin, in Germany somewhere, where there are these Gita schools, Vedanta schools. But the problem with us Indians is we have made all this into philosophies. Gita philosophy, Vedanta philosophy, Upanishadic philosophy. And a philosophy, wherein we discuss a few things, and then we get into the nitty-gritty of the problems and the solutions and what Shankara says, what Ramanuja says, what Gita. It's become a kind of a debating point. We never go into the experiential point. So Gita has survived all these millennia thanks to those few Mirabais and Andas and Ramdasas. Some people have lived it, and that is why it has lived on. And Aurobindo, to begin with, was a perfect Gita yogin. In fact, his whole sadhana starts from being a yogi of the Gita type. He practiced the Gita fully. So here was another person who lived the Gita, who realized the Gita, and then he wrote about the essays on the Gita. So these are not just commentaries. These are his own personal experiences. So everything that he writes, it of course is based on the Gita, but it is supported by his own personal experience. So he would say that once the inner awakens, all these external things are abandoned. There are in the world, in fact, two different laws of conduct, each valid on its own plane, The rule principally dependent on the external status, and the rule independent of status and entirely dependent on the thought and conscience. The Gita does not teach us to subordinate the higher plane to the lower. It does not ask the awakened moral consciousness to slay itself on the altar of duty as a sacrifice and victim to the law of the social status. It calls us higher and not lower. From the conflict of the two planes, it bids us ascend to a supreme poise above the mainly practical, above the purely ethical, to the Brahmic consciousness. It replaces the conception of social duty by a divine obligation. So this is what we have to concentrate upon. Normally, human beings are guided by two principles. One, as we said, principle dependent on the external status. That means our external works, our external duties, our external norms, what society says, what this office says, what the individual says, what this company says. The other one is based on your ethics, that you are guided by your ethics, by your religion, that morally you should not do that, that kind of an ethical teaching. But the Gita is neither depending on the so-called duties nor on the ethics, but it is asking you to listen to your inner voice. To the inner voice, because Sri Krishna says, I am within you and I guide you from within. You see, this question of that Sri Krishna becomes the Rathasarathi, that means guiding Arjuna sitting in the Ratha, in the chariot. Sri Krishna becomes the charioteer. It's only an external symbol that the same Sri Krishna is within us, guiding the chariot of my life. And it is this guidance that is important. So he would say that it is neither the practical nor the ethical, but it is the spiritual that is emphasized. But please remember, always this underlying caution should be there, that we should not jump to spirituality. That is one big mistake we could do. Just because we have heard the Gita and then we are excited about its teaching and we say, from tomorrow I'll like to be like that. All these are mental decisions. And mental decisions have no strength to pursue, to continue. They last a few days, a few weeks, a few months, and then, because there is something called the vital within us, the emotional, the desires, the satisfactions. The body itself wants some fulfillments and satisfactions. So you cannot suppress these too long by the mental decisions. So they come up. So sometimes we say, oh, now we see this person is coming out in his true colors. That means true colors means what was hidden within is coming out. So he would say, this is a stage, the outer, the ethical and the spiritual. You have to pass through this. The faster, the quicker you pass, the better. But pass through this, that's important. So he says that it replaces the conception of social duty by a divine obligation. That means a divine obligation, what you hear within. What your master says, if you have come to Aurobindo and the mother, see what they have said in their writings. I'm emphasizing upon this because their writings have the same living force that was there in their physical body. So if we can be guided precisely by their writings, and therefore, if in the writings they said certain things, well, everything perhaps we may not be able to follow, but still we can make a beginning. The subjection to external law gives place to a certain principle of inner self-determination of action, proceeding by the soul's freedom from the tangled law of works. And this we shall see the Brahmic consciousness, the soul's freedom from works, and the determination of works in the nature by the Lord within and above us, is the kernel of the Gita's teaching with regard to action. So the subjection to external law gives place to a certain principle of inner self-determination of action. This is the main thing. That's what Sri Aurobindo says, the kernel of the Gita's teaching. What is it? The subjection to external law. External law, external duty. External duty to mental consciousness. You see, although the Gita does not really use this terminology of mental consciousness, vital consciousness, etc., which comes in from Sri Aurobindo, it's easier for us to relate like this in the contemporary world because we understand what is mental consciousness. So, as long as we are in this mental consciousness, we are subjected to it and we follow all the norms. And you see, the present generation, the youth, is trying to break these norms. And they argue saying, why not? So, the present, people all over the world, they think, what's happening to the youth? They are going astray, and all the norms and rules and conceptions and regularization, they're all being broken down. Well, there are two ways of looking at it. One is they are breaking it down in a way, maybe they're making a path for something new. Because it is always necessary to break down the Berlin Wall to let a freedom of expression come forth. So it is perhaps necessary to break down this mental consciousness which was thinking itself to be the supreme, the highest level of consciousness. So when the youth is challenging, it's a good thing. In fact, that is what Sri Aurobindo would say in the human cycle. The age of subjectivism comes in. People question all the morality, all the norms and all the duties. So this is the age of subjectivism where the individual, no, not the subjectivism, individual age, where the individual comes forward and questions all systems that have been established. And it is important because after this age of individualism will come the age of subjectivism. When all this falls, why I'm saying the word falls? Because all these things of the mind, they get petrified, they get fossilized, they become, junk. But we are decorating all those rules saying, no, this is what our Shastra said, this is what this thing said. So the modern youth is trying to really break into all that. So from the point of view of evolution, it is good. Because our complete faith in the mind is being shaken. And it is important that it should be shaken. Because there's something beyond mind that is coming down. So our full trust and surrender to the mind must be shaken down. There's a kind of, rumbling in the mental consciousness, and with this rumbling, the volcanic rumbling, the whole thing collapses, and then a new structure of the overmind may come in. But there is also something else, that with this shaking up, the youth are just shaking it up, but they're not finding the new, the beyond, the mental consciousness. That's because they don't have the true guidance. They're ready to shake down the pillars. But if you say after shaking, what are you going to do? Live on this debris or go into a new consciousness? But the new consciousness is where they're confused. And lots and lots of gurus and yogis and teachers and professors and acharyas are coming, trying to give them something new, but it's the same thing, the old in a refashioned manner. Except, of course, we find in Sri Aurobindo and the Mother that new consciousness. That is why, we take the trouble of spreading this word of Sri Aurobindo, because it's spreading the new consciousness. So coming here, that's what Sri Aurobindo is telling us. The subjection to the external law gives place to a certain principle of inner self-determination of action, proceeding by the soul's freedom from the tangled law of works. So we have to proceed ultimately by an inner self-determinism. But this is what I was trying to comment upon, that the youth, the modern young people are not getting this inner self-determinism. They go by the fashion of shaking up the mind, but have they found the inner? Are they trying to find the inner? But unfortunately, the swing is not trying to find the inner self-determinism. The outer materialism, the vital movement, the vital dances, the vital songs are still so very attractive that the en masse the youth is moving towards that. So there is this great confusion because the new is not yet found, the old is floundering. That is where we are all caught in at present. So and this, as we shall see, or what the Gita is telling us, and this, as we shall see, the Brahmic consciousness, the soul's freedom from works, and the determination of works in the nature by the Lord within and above us, is the kernel of the Gita's teaching. So what is Gita's teaching here? That we have to find that Brahmic consciousness, or maybe it's a big word, let us say the inner consciousness, or the consciousness of our inner voice, and be determined by that. And once we have that freedom, then this question of, we can have this sarva dharman parityaja. Then we don't have to be determined, guided by these external laws, and we can really have a new spiritual law guiding us. And this is the effort of Sri Krishna, that to give a new law of action, not a new philosophy. That is the essential target of Sri Krishna, that we must find a new law of action, because we have to act in the world. So what is the law based on? Either it's based on duty, your morality, your religion, or the spirituality, the spiritual law. So Sri Krishna is jumping right from the practical step that Arjuna is proposing straight to the spiritual ones. But he cannot tell Arjuna straight away, do this. He has to convince the mind of Arjuna to give up its limitations and accept the new. In fact, as I was telling you yesterday, that most of us, this is the problem, our mind is not yet convinced. We read the Gita, we read the Life Divine, we read the Savitri, but the mind brings back the old things, the vital brings back the whole old habits, because there is not sufficient conviction so that there can be a beginning of a transformation. This is the whole problem. But Sri Krishna achieves this marvelously in the Gita. He convinces Arjuna's mind, to the extent that it is ready to transform itself, open itself to the new. So the growth of the mind, what we say, the development of the mind is important. Why we should read Sri Aurobindo, why we should try to understand a bit of Gita and all that, is that the mind gets mature. It gets convinced that yes, there is something beyond me. But that only a matured mind will get convinced, not an immature, a mind that is not developed. Because a mind that is not yet developed, he seeks to develop more and more. I want more knowledge, I want more computers, I want more this and more that. But once you come to spirituality and these books, then the mind realizes, my God, all this knowledge is nothing. That there is a greater knowledge. And that is the beginning of the mind's opening to the higher consciousness. That is the success story of the Gita. So you see, Gita is not just time-bound, it's 2,500 years back or 4,500 years back. It is not at all important. It is there right today, it's giving an answer to the present problem. So that is where we see the transformation that takes place in Arjuna. And of course, now next we will see a little more discussion into the right action, etc. And then we have a concluding paragraph or two.